Stan Gibilisco here, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1GV, Whiskey 1 Good Vibrations. In the last video or two, I described some situations having to do with my stay at my parents' house as I recovered from an injury and illness during the winter of 1987 to 1988, when I was 34 years old. This was in Rochester, Minnesota, and as you may know, the winters in that part of the country can get pretty cold. As I remember, we had about a foot of snow on the ground most of the time, and temperatures frequently went below 0 Fahrenheit. My right arm was completely paralyzed at that point, and the pain was oftentimes incredible. I almost asked them to chop that arm off, but they said that even if they did that, phantom pain could occur and it would still hurt even though it wasn't there. But anyway, that's not the point of this video. The point of this video is to go into a little bit more exotic detail about that 800-foot long wire antenna that I strung out the window of my bedroom in the lower level of that house, through a bunch of trees, and ultimately to a ground rod pounded into the hard, cold, frosty soil of Minnesota, despite the difficulties, to prevent electrostatic charge buildup from occurring, which on a wire that long can get quite formidable even when the weather lacks thunderstorm activity anywhere in the vicinity. I explained that a while back. This is something else. Any long wire not terminated in its natural characteristic impedance, not terminated in a resistor going to ground that it has the same value of its natural characteristic impedance, that is 600 to 800 ohms, and capable of dissipating at least half of the output power of the transmitter. Any long wire that doesn't have that termination will exhibit resonance, often many resonances if it's very many wavelengths long, sort of like a wind instrument does. If you've ever played around with acoustic cavities, like, I guess the best example I can give is a trombone. You can sometimes play one note in its second harmonic, and maybe even, if you've got good enough lips and a good enough mouthpiece, you can play its third harmonic. I once put a trumpet mouthpiece in a trombone and was able to get the third harmonic of the fundamental resonant acoustic frequency. Similarly, string instruments resonate because of sound acoustic wave propagation through the solid material of the taut string, like cellos and violins. Cellos making lower notes, and violins and violas and things like that making higher notes, and the bass guitar, of course, making the lowest notes of all. Even Eddie Rickenbacker's, no, not Eddie Rickenbacker, I'm getting it mixed up. Roger McGuinn's Rickenbacker guitar of the famed band The Byrds in the 1960s operated according to that principle. His classic Rickenbacker guitar sound. And as with all those wind and string musical instruments that you commonly hear in bands and orchestras, that 800-foot long wire had a natural resonant frequency too. And when it was stimulated by vibration, such as wind, it would play that note sometimes. I don't know, I guess it must have been the fundamental frequency, the lowest frequency of resonance, because it was around 600 hertz or so. It was a humming sound that would occur when it was windy. because the antenna, you see, went out the window and through the tops of several trees without being fastened anywhere to those trees. And then, finally, through the top of the last tree to the ground rod that I had terminating it at the far end. If the wind blew, those trees could slide back and forth. The little crooks in the branches that held the wires up would slide back and forth along the wire. There was one solid length of aluminum ground wire. Unfortunately, as you may know, aluminum does stretch, especially when it's that long, but I didn't care about that so much. I didn't have to make it that tight. It didn't have to endure a lot of stress because these branches, as they moved in the wind, would slide along the wire. And the way that I got that wire in the crooks of those branches was the bow and arrow method, where you tie a string to the end of an arrow, fire it from a bow, like an archery bow, over the tree that you want to use as a support, and you keep trying that until you get that string to land in exactly the niche you want, which is usually quite high in the tree, the highest you can get in practice. Alternatively, you can fly a balloon on a windy day and get it to slope and fly it with a string, and you can literally guide that string right to where you want it, and then pull the far end down, and from there pull the wire along, attach the wire to the string, the far end of the wire, and pull that through. And I did that multiple times in 0-degree Fahrenheit weather with a paralyzed arm. I was a stubborn old coot then, or a stubborn young brat. Now I'm a stubborn old coot. But anyway, that thing got strung up, and it was essentially a very large string instrument like you would see in an orchestra with a single string, the antenna. And when the wind blew, like the bow being drawn across the string of a bass guitar or a cello, that wire would hum at about 600 hertz. And that hum, that acoustic noise, not electronic, but acoustic, would somehow or another conduct into the house through the opening that I provided for the antenna, the feed-through insulator that I used to run it into the house. I think I just slammed or cranked the window shut with its rubber insulation on the antenna, because that did not conduct the insulation around the window. I just cranked the window shut on there, and the wire became taut, ran it to my Johnson Viking Matchbox Transmatch, but that vibration would get transferred into the window frame structure. And as I lay on my bed some nights, when the wind blew in the winter, the cold wind of Minnesota winter night, that hum would act as a sort of mesmerizing sound to get my mind off of the pain. And I would imagine that same wire, as it made that hum, those acoustic waves propagating along it, that same wire at radio frequencies would turn those RF currents into electromagnetic fields that would propagate off into interstellar space were it not for the ionosphere. And sometimes at higher frequencies, of course, it would pass through into interstellar space, and I imagined what alien civilization, decades and centuries from now, would hear my signals from that wire, and what they would do, whether they would decide that it was time to visit Earth and open contact with humanity. I would dream all sorts of fantasies, daydream, night dream, and ultimately that hum would serve as a lullaby to put me to sleep. My parents were in an upstairs bedroom, and evidently they didn't hear that hum because they never complained about it. And it didn't occur that often. The wind had to be just right, out of the right direction, and circumstances had to be just so. But I thought it was an interesting phenomenon with long wire antennas that all antennas actually have an acoustic resonant frequency, a fundamental frequency, as well as an RF resonant frequency. We just don't notice it because we're usually not putting our ear up to our wire antennas to see whether we hear anything, especially when it's 20 or 30 meters up above the ground. Although I suppose it's been done by some nutcase out there somewhere. Just a little story for you to make you, hopefully at least make you smile, if not make you laugh, and certainly to make you say that there sure is one weird ham radio out there in the black holes of Dakota Territory. United States of Amateur Radio, United States of Acoustic Antennas, saying 73 for now, signing off, and so long, which, of course, on that antenna or any other, always translated in my native fist to da-da-da-da-da-da.